Okay, so let's look a little bit closer at what's happening once you zoom into the striations you see in a muscle, in the skeletal muscles. So these are really important. Each individual one is called a sarcomere, and they're really important because you have these overlapping filaments called actin and myosin, and those are going to become really important players. Anywhere you have from when you're going, so this is kind of reverse of what's happening here. So anytime when you go from one of these lines to the next one, that's called a sarcomere, and that's going to be one contraction point. Okay, so when these two things come together, we're going to see, and it's really I've linked a couple animations in the module notes because this is a lot easier to see if you're watching an animation of it. So the idea is these little heads reach out, grab a part of the actin, and then they contract, so the whole thing contracts. So within your muscle, we just see one contraction, one giant contraction, but what's happening is millions and millions of actin and myosin fibers are interacting and pulling, and that overall action causes a muscle contraction. Very important. Let's talk about all the parts. So there's a lot of things happening. This is called the sliding filament theory. And in science, when we say theory, this is a problem with English vernacular. So if you say in English vernacular, I have a theory, it's just an idea, you want to test it out. In science or in medical stuff, when you say that's a theory, like the theory of relativity, the theory of gravity, the theory of I guess gravity's a law by now. Or has been for a while. If you theory of evolution, that kind of thing. That's a big deal, and this is just scientists not being good at picking words, basically. But a theory in medical or scientific terminology is a big deal. It's been proven. If anybody can disprove it, it's going to stop being called a theory. If there's one piece of evidence, it goes against it. But if something is called a theory in medical science, it's 100% considered legit. Okay, so what's happening? The overall action here is that you have this sarcomere going from one band to another, one side of the band to another. When the myosin heads, which is this part, reach out, they grab the actin heads, and then they pull them together, kind of like sliding glass doors. So they or like curtains, and they pull together, and the whole thing contracts. Now that's happening at each point, so all the sarcomeres do this at the same time. If you have a twitch, it might be because some are getting signals they shouldn't be getting, and you have a little spasm go on. So a spasm is just anytime you have unregulated muscle control. So the filaments overlap more when the muscle is contracted. They themselves do not contract. So the filament, the whole thing as a whole, doesn't cause a contraction. It's within the sarcomeres inside the filaments that contraction happens, and then that causes the whole muscle to look like it is contracting. So it does contract. Because this is happening millions of times over, the entire muscle shortens, which we call a muscle contraction. But the actual contraction happens at the cellular level within the cell itself. So what's happening here? So there's two big players, myosin and actin. We like to anthropomorphize them because it's like a star-crossed lover. Oh my god, myosin really just wants to reach out and touch actin, and if they do, they will cuddle, and it'll be beautiful, and a contraction will happen, and then there's this jerk that wraps around actin called tropomyosin, which is like, no! It's basically the cock blocker of or I shouldn't say that word in a lecture. It is the friend that doesn't want you to hang out with somebody because they don't like them for you, and it's like, no, back off. You cannot hang out with this person. It's blocking the active sites of this fiber. Okay, so we have myosin. It looks like a bunch of golf clubs. They have these heads that reach out, and they're called globular parts. Very fancy, that stick out. The myosin heads, and they only bind to actin if there's calcium present. We're going to see why that is soon. Actin itself is this twisted helix also, or it's a twisted helix, and around that we have tropomyosin covering these binding active sites on actin. Within that we have these weird looking guys called troponin, and that is going to be, it's basically a little Lego. It's in the way, and it's only going to cause the release of tropomyosin if you have calcium. So basically, we need calcium in order to get this to work. So if you have, a lot of times when you're having a muscle cramp or something, people will say, oh, obviously you need to drink more milk or eat more cheese because you need more calcium in your diet. And it's true, the reason why we need calcium in this case, and remember, our bones act as a source of calcium when we're starting going to get low. Why you need calcium, one of the many reasons, is because it causes muscle, or it allows muscle contractions to happen. Okay, so when troponin pulls on tropomyosin, it pulls it away and it exposes these active sites so that myosin can go in there, grab the actin, and cause a contraction. So what's happening here? Okay, so let me think about this. So here again is our sarcomere. Okay, so here's where the actin and the myosin are happening. Okay, so here's the myosin here, here's the actin. Muscle cells, because they're doing something very specific, and muscles are kind of funny, they're like a very specific kind of cell. They get a bunch of their own names. So the sarcolemma is the plasma membrane. And again, if you go back and you watch this lecture, we talk a lot about this. So the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane, is what surrounds the cell as a whole. In the proteins, that's called the sarcolemma. Awesome. It's just a plasma membrane that contains the cell. So an interesting thing about these cells is that the sarcolemma actually breaks down between a lot of them as your muscle cells are developing, and you get basically a merging of a bunch of different cells to get these long fibers, and so they are multinucleated. There's many nucleus in all of them. Instead of saying cytoplasm filling these cells, it's called sarcoplasm. So you may be catching on that sarco is a word for, I think it's a Greek word for muscle. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is analogous to the endoplasmic reticulum, and what the endoplasmic reticulum does in a general cell is produce proteins and lipids, and so we're going to see what it does. It's a storage point, basically. We're going to see it does something very similar in the muscle, but we call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum instead. Okay, so we have these fibers. The fibers are surrounded by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's going to be important because that's going to be where storage is going to happen. We have these tubules that are going to be running between each cell, which are kind of like they're pores. They're called transverse tubules, and it allows the sarcoplasmic reticulum to be really close to the surface at all times. So basically, it's like being close to an exit at all times. Very important. And then we have these big old mitochondria, which are also very important because mitochondria, remember, powerhouse of the cell. What does that mean? It means it provides a lot of energy, and energy in cells is called the energy currency molecule is the ATP molecule. We're going to see that's really, really important. And you also have these glycogen granules. And glycogen is just a stored form of glucose, so a stored form of food. And so you can see that muscles have both a lot of energy around, and they have a lot of food around that can then be converted into energy really quickly. So muscles they get a lot of special treatment because they're really important, and they're doing a lot of work that a general cell is not doing. Okay, so how do we make this contraction happen? We've talked about the parts of a muscle cell. We've talked about how we have to get that myosin to bind to that actin to make a contraction happen. We have we have energy around, we have food around, we have lots of just everything we need. So how do we make it actually happen? So the very first thing that has to happen here is that you have to have nerve stimulus. And so remember, these are skeletal muscles. They have to be activated by your brain saying, hey, do a thing. Or some kind of external signal that says, hey, tell the brain that it's cold, or whatever, okay? So the first thing that has to happen to make a muscle contraction happen is a nerve has to send a signal, or an action potential, which we'll talk about later, to the muscle itself. So this is a nerve, and it's going, something needs to happen! And it goes, and it causes it is synapsed, or connected at the muscle itself. So this is the end of a long nerve chain, perhaps, that then goes to the foot and says, move, we need to walk, or whatever it is. It could be going to your muscles in your torso to say, sit up, you've been slouching for too long, why do you do this to yourself? You know, maybe not the last part, but the rest of it, telling your muscles to contract to have better posture, whatever it is. Okay, so then, the nerve releases some stuff through these vesicles. Remember, vesicles are just little containers that go, and then they can bind with the membrane, and then basically they do exocytosis, so they release a whole bunch of neurotransmitters, which then, in this case, instead of going to another neuron, which is what usually happens, they release onto the muscle itself, okay? And so this is called the neuromuscular junction because it's where the neuron touches a muscle. Yay! It's a nice, easy way to remember it. So what happens is this signal, these little chemical messengers, are going to go across that gap, and what the specific thing that's being released is called acetylcholine, or ACH. Very important. Remember this word, acetylcholine. It is the signal from the neuron to tell the muscle it's time to contract. But acetylcholine doesn't actually cause the contraction. There's actually several steps that have to happen, and this is important because what if a neuron releases just a little bit of acetylcholine, but it was kind of a mistake and you don't actually want it to do anything? Oh, it's good to have a lot of steps in between to make sure you're really getting what you need to happen. It also is a pain to have to memorize in an early anatomy class, but it's okay. I believe in you. I know you can do it. You memorized 100 bones. You're memorizing another 36 muscles. I believe in you. So, first chemical to remember is acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the chemical messenger being released by the nerve onto the muscle to cause a muscle contraction. So, what does acetylcholine do? Acetylcholine goes and it binds to a binds to a receptor on the fiber, and then it causes something else to happen. So, it basically acetylcholine goes and binds the outside of each fiber, and it causes a difference in, it causes what's called an action potential. And I'm trying to think of an easy way to explain this. There's not really a way. It just basically causes an electrical change in the entire muscle fiber as far as it can go. So which means you only really need one neuron to touch one muscle to cause an action, which is good because remember, there are millions of these sarcomeres and you want them all to contract at the same time. So basically what acetylcholine does is say, hey, everybody wake up, pay attention, something's happening. Okay, so step 2 is, so we have acetylcholine, it goes and it causes the sarcolemma to become active. Okay, so, and it does this by, do I want you to know why? Nah, not really. So now the acetylcholine has woken up all of the sarcolemma, so the entire cell, with an action potential, and that causes remember the sarcoplasmic reticulum? The sarcoplasmic reticulum for all this time has been containing calcium. So that action potential, which activates all of the sarcolemma, causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. Sweet! Now we have calcium that's been released, and we know we need calcium in order to get the actin and the myosin to talk to each other. Awesome. Anything else? No. Okay, that's it. So now let's look at our steps. We have acetylcholine being released from the nerve. It I'm trying to think of the word. It activates all of the the sarcolemma, the entire plasma membrane that's surrounding the entire muscle fiber, which is really long, which is why we have to activate the whole thing. That activation causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium. So now that's 3 steps. Okay, awesome. Now that we have a whole bunch of calcium flooding into the muscle fiber, the calcium's floating around. Oh, it goes and it binds to troponin. I got too excited there. So it binds to troponin. It doesn't bind to tropomyosin. And I know those words are horrible, but you gotta think of a way to distinguish them in your brain. So once calcium has bound to troponin, it moves a little bit. Every time you have a binding happen, usually what you get is a change of shape. So we've changed the shape of the troponin that scooches over the tropomyosin. And then look at this! We have these active sites on that actin. It's on the actin where we have these active sites that are now totally open, saying, here I am, which is awesome because that's what myosin gets to bind to. So what are we at, step 5? It's called the power stroke. And so what happens is now that troponin is out of the way, troponin has moved tropomyosin out of the way, well, that's all myosin has been waiting for. Myosin has been waiting all this time, just waiting for a chance to swoop in and grab that actin. And so when it does, as soon as the troponin moves the tropomyosin out of the way, boom, myosin is there to grab it. Okay? And so it attaches to those actin filaments, and as soon as it does, it contracts. As soon as it touches actin, it contracts. Boom! It's happened. And so because this is happening in both directions, let's see. Oh, I don't have a good picture of this. We'll get to it in a second. So remember, this is like a sliding glass door. So let's go boop, boop, boop here. So this is happening on both sides. So troponin has moved tropomyosin. Myosin now can attach to actin. It's happening on both sides. As soon as it attaches to actin, it contracts and the whole thing pulls together closer. Boop, like this. Very exciting. Everybody's happy. Cool. So then what happens? Because you have to then release. How do you get actin to release the myosin? Because if you don't, then rigor mortis sets in. So once you have to be able to release, remember the agonist and the antagonist pairing. If you don't have a way to release that actin, how can the other muscle contract if this muscle won't stop contracting? So in order to release actin, you may notice these letters here. I kind of avoided it for a second. But what's happened is energy has already been spent so that the myosin is always ready. It's ready. It's basically been waiting its whole life. Oh my God. It's so excited to reach out and grab that actin. But it used up its energy. Its energy is gone. And so the only way to get this action to happen again or to release is to put more energy into the system. So in order to release the new actin, you have to have a new energy molecule, a new piece of ATP. Remember, once ATP is used, it's called ADP. So it's lost a phosphate, gone from adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate. Oh, here's a phosphate right here. That means it's already been used up. Okay, because the phosphate has already been released, that high energy bond has been released to cause this to be in its cocked state, and so then it can, boom, hit that actin when it's ready, okay? But then, so if you have energy present, it's going to go in and it's going to pop onto this myosin and cause myosin to release. Well, as soon as myosin releases, if troponin is still holding tropomyosin, so the active sites are open, myosin's just going to grab another one. And so myosin's going to go and it's going to grab another, and you get more and more contraction. Awesome. So this is going to keep repeating as long as calcium is present and as long as there's enough ATP around to recock that myosin so it goes back into the cocked position. Okay, it's like cocking a gun and just waiting to pull the trigger is basically what's happening. Every time you have a chance to cock the gun and then wait for action, you're going to do it. Awesome. So then how do you get this whole action thing to stop? Like, there's only so much that you can contract a muscle, and then sometimes you want to stop contraction altogether so that you can lay down, or you can extend, or you can supinate, or whatever it is, whatever opposite action you want to do, so those muscles will stop contracting. Maybe you winked at someone, and it's creepy, and you have to stop winking. Whatever it is, you got to end that contraction somehow. The only way this happens if you you have to have another electrical signal. So, okay, you have to basically go through the entire action again. So the thing that caused this whole thing to start was that electrical signal from the acetylcholine, right? So that has to stop. So you have to the nerve has to stop telling the muscle to act. And then acetylcholine, once the nerve is no longer telling it to act, acetylcholine has to run out. And so if you're worried that there's too much acetylcholine, you have something called acetylcholinesterase, acetylcholinesterase, which is an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. See, PowerPoint doesn't even believe this exists, but that's what it's called. So if you've broken down acetylcholine, there's no more acetylcholine, then the SR, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, is like, well, then I guess I'm going to collect all my calcium, and it picks all that calcium back up out of the cytoplasm so that it isn't just floating around there anymore, because you don't need it. It needs to go back where it's supposed to be. So acetylcholine keeps the calcium present, so the lack of acetylcholine makes calcium go away. Without calcium around, so now that calcium's been stored, those binding sites are blocked on tropomyosin. Troponin no longer has calcium. Calcium's going to be popping on and off as it is wont to do. And so once calcium starts being sucked out of the cell and back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, those active sites are going to be covered up again. Because remember, you have to have calcium present to move the tropomyosin so that actin can be bound by myosin. So with no calcium, there's no binding sites, so you don't get any more motion. And then once myosin all pops off, so once all of that myosin has released the actin, the muscle can relax. The muscle goes back to its resting length. It extends once again. All right. So when it's at rest, so once all of this has been covered up so that myosin can't touch it anymore, there's still a little bit of ATP present to cock all the myosin back so it's ready to go. Because the important thing about muscles is it's a lot easier when you're at rest to put in the energy to be waiting in case the muscle, because basically your body's always worried you're about to get eaten by a lion or something horrible is going to happen, and you have to be able to use your muscles at a moment's notice. So through evolution, we've evolved a system so that we're always ready to go. And so it's a lot easier to have this system ready and waiting than to have to then wait that extra microsecond to cock the myosin and then let it attach. So at rest, the myosin is cocked and ready to go. It's just that it's blocked and can't bind the actin, so it doesn't allow any action to happen. Okay, so while we're at rest, what else is happening? So we've cocked myosin by taking any extra ATP and binding it up so that the myosin is ready to go. Calcium is continuing to be taken out of the cytoplasm, or the sarcoplasm is what this should say. Oh no, sarcoplasm. Oh goodness, sarcoplasm. And it's being stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, again, so that it's there and ready to go when we need it. Okay? Which means ATP is used, we use up that ATP before we are even thinking about contraction, because again, it's easier to spend that energy early and then be ready to go. All right, so I kind of already said all of this. So each myofibril has thousands of sarcomeres. Remember that each myofibril, let's go back up here real quick. So if you think about it, if each myofibril contains thousands of sarcomeres, each fiber contains hundreds of myofibrils, and then each fascicle contains hundreds of fibers. That's millions of filaments ready for contraction within each muscle, which is why we, as you know, these huge organisms compared to microorganisms, can have a muscle contraction that allows us to pick up a 50-pound bag of dog food, or your 50-pound dog, and have that action and work against gravity in a way that is actually meaningful. So that's important. That's a lot of stuff happening at once in each sarcomere. All of this is happening. So now you can look at this and say, okay, this is that midline. There's the myosin. Here's the actin. If contraction happens, this whole thing shortens. Awesome. When contraction is happening, myosin heads are grabbing and releasing 5 times per second during a contraction to keep keep contraction happening. So that's important. It's a very fast reaction. We want to make sure it's working. Let's see. Oh, actually, this is kind of interesting. What is a better analogy for a muscle contraction? Is it like a crew, or is it like a tug-of-war? Are they working? Because it looks like it's kind of a tug-of-war system where they're pulling, but really it's a crew system where you have a whole bunch of things moving in one direction and the other, but they're going to be coming together. So that's good. I don't care about this. Let's move on. Okay. So what two steps require ATP? So that's going to be the storing of calcium back in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the cocking of the myosin fibers. What good test questions. Why might it be accurate to say that ATP is not really needed for the muscle contraction? Well, during contraction, you don't use up ATP. It's before contraction, when you're getting the muscle ready, that you need ATP, which is kind of why if you aren't, well, we won't go into that. So what happens when a muscle runs out of ATP completely? You're not going to be able to recock the muscle for a little while. So if you think about that, what's a stiff? So if someone is, if you watch any crime shows, and then you've seen the word or if you've read any like Raymond Chandler, people will say like, who's the stiff? And that is a dead body that's in rigor mortis. So in rigor mortis, what's happening is you've run out of ATP because someone is dead, and if you don't have ATP, you can't stop a contraction. And so if you can't stop a contraction, the muscle is going to get really stiff. So all the muscles have tried to contract during death in order to cause, or maybe they're contracted for whatever reason, and they now can't uncontract. They can't relax because there's no ATP there to cause the tropomyosin to move and to cause those myosin fibers to recock, so they're basically stuck in that active position and they can't stop it. So rigor mortis sets in after however many hours. It goes away eventually because just the myosin starts to break down because someone is dead, and so that is the cycle there in a very abbreviated and short way to talk about it. Okay, so how do we talked a little bit about aerobic cellular respiration, or how to make ATP. So I don't really want to talk about it anymore, but that's one important thing we have to have. The reason why it's important to take really deep breaths when you're exercising, is that if you're going to be breaking down glucose to make ATP, which we need for energy, you have to have oxygen present. So if you're taking really short breaths, you're going to run out of ATP faster. One way to so muscles need so much ATP in order to continue that contraction and relaxation process. So you need about 600 trillion ATPs per second. At rest, a muscle cell makes more ATP than it can use, which is good. Some of that excess energy can be transferred to another high energy molecule, which you may have heard of in the form of creatine powder. It's called creatine phosphate. So creatine is an amino acid derivative that can accept a phosphate and hold it. So then if you have some ADP that needs to become ATP, it's basically waiting to pass on that high energy particle. So this is coupled with synthesis and hydrolysis of ATP. So basically our muscles hang on to some creatine in order to have another source of energy during muscle contractions. A lot of times people take creatine powder when they're bodybuilding or training or something. The problem is that our digestive system doesn't let you absorb a lot of creatine because our digestive system doesn't recognize it as something really important, and so it's hard to take in extra creatine. A lot of times when people are seeing a big change, it's actually because they're just drinking a lot of water, and water is used for lots of other things. It's actually used in the production of ATP also. It's complicated. We're not going to go into it very much, but creatine phosphate is basically another energy reserve that our muscles hang on to. Not only that, but our muscles allow anaerobic respiration. Okay, so creatine phosphate is like, let's see, you don't need any glucose when it happens, okay? Whereas in cellular respiration, you have to have glucose. But the nice thing is that there's something called myoglobin. So myoglobin is a product, it's a particle that exists just in the muscles. In order to have myoglobin is different. I'm thinking of glycogen. Remember those glycogen globules I talked about? There's just all the sugar in our muscles waiting to be used in the mitochondria to make more ATP. So that's good. We have all this food ready for our muscles just present. So hemoglobin exists in our blood system in order to move oxygen around. Well, you have to have oxygen in order to make ATP. So our muscles have their own kind of hemoglobin called myoglobin, because myo is another root meaning muscle, and it's a backup supply of oxygen that exists just in our muscles. So this has actually been in evolution. It's interesting if you think about how does an animal like a sperm whale, how does it take in enough oxygen when it takes a breath at the surface to be able to dive for 2 hours or whatever it is without dying, without suffocating? And what they do is they have so much myoglobin that when they take in a huge breath of air, and that oxygen, instead of just existing in the bloodstream, it's in the muscles themselves waiting to be used. And then if they need it to breathe instead of making ATP, they steal that oxygen away from the muscles to be used. And it seems to work great for them. So creatine phosphate, remember, is another place where we just it makes a little bit of ATP. It's used up in 30 seconds, but if you need that extra 30 seconds of energy, then that's great. Because once you've run out of ATP through cellular respiration and you've used up all of your creatine phosphate, you start doing anaerobic respiration. And this is fermentation. This is done in the cytoplasm. It doesn't require oxygen, and it only makes a little bit of ATP, and it also creates lactic acid. So where lactic acid tells our body, we receive lactic acid as pain, so it activates a pain sensor, because it's basically saying, this is our last reserve of oxygen, this is our last reserve of ATP. If you don't get us energy, we're going to stop working. So whatever you're doing, you have to stop, because holy cow, this is horrible. And so that's why cramps happen. They're telling your body, you need to take a break because I need to make more energy. And so that's the third process that happens in order for us to have energy. And it's the process that is painful. So we will stop doing what we're doing and take a break. Okay, so within the skeletal muscles, we have two different flavors of skeletal muscles. We have what are called slow twitch fibers and fast twitch fibers. They do what they say they do. The slow twitch ones contract slower. The fast ones contract faster. This is the difference between red and white meat. Okay, so white meat are those fast twitch fibers. They're white because they don't have as much of a blood system. They don't have as much myoglobin. They don't have as much mitochondria. And they fatigue really quickly, which apparently this is spelled very wrong. And so what's happening here is they have a lot of glycolysis enzymes, which means they can break down sugar really quickly, so they can have a good energy source. The fast twitch muscles, what they do is that they're basically there for reflexes. And so if you need something to happen that's really powerful to get you out of a system really quickly, that's your fast twitch muscle. So if someone comes up behind you and grabs you and you jump, that's your fast twitch muscle saying something bad happened because you weren't expecting it. On the other hand, your slow twitch muscles, or your red meat, your red fibers, they're red because they have a very strong blood system. They have a lot of capillaries that allows for a lot of myoglobin to be present, which is red. And they have a lot of mitochondria, which is also red. And they have really good stamina. So this is when, if you're running, if you have to train your muscles to do this, obviously, but these are the ones that you control, whereas the fast twitch muscles you don't control as much because they are the reflexes. So that means they're skipping the brain and just acting through the spinal cord. You have to, these are the ones that you are in control of using. These are the ones that are reflexes and trying to get you to get out of bad situations, or if it's a stress situation, or just, you don't need to control so much how quickly you blink, right? And they don't have to be super innervated. You're just blinking to lubricate your eyeball. You don't have to do that a million times. And if you try to blink, like you might be doing right now, if you try to blink a lot, they get tired because you use up all that fiber. So sometimes you can control this. Most of the time it's stuff we don't control. Whereas the slow twitch muscles are red fibers. They are the ones that we do control, so they have to have good stamina so we can keep using them. But again, you have to work out in order to have these things happen. And there's other reasons to work out we're not going to go into. Okay, so there's two different kinds of muscle sizes. If you have what's called hypertrophy, that's where you increase due to adding more filaments. It's not new cells, it's just within the cell you start creating new filaments. Okay, so this happens if you are doing resistance training, so if you're working out. If you are, and basically and resistance training is like weight training and that kind of thing. If you're just doing cardio, depending on what kind of cardio you're doing, that's not so much resistance training. Testosterone causes muscles to get bigger, so the reason why guy voices drop during puberty is because you have a release of testosterone. Your vocal cords are muscles, and so that testosterone hits that muscle just like all the other muscles. They grow considerably, which is why Adam's apples exist. It's actually those muscles poking out of the causing a sizable lump in the throat. And the reason why the voice drops is it's like the bigger string on a guitar has a lower voice, or has a lower sound. Same thing if you have a bigger vocal cord, you have a lower sound. Yeah, we're just gonna go to that. So testosterone is an anabolic steroid. It's a natural one. So anabolic, remember, means to build up. If you take other anabolic steroids, or if you take more testosterone, you're going to also build up muscles. The problem is that if you're taking anabolic steroids, your body is like, awesome, I don't have to make testosterone because you're taking testosterone. And so a lot of the things that testosterone does is not just muscle building. It has to do with reproduction and other things. If you're taking anabolic steroids that tell your brain, I don't need testosterone anymore, you lose that, okay? So you get a lot of negative feedback that say, I don't need to maintain the size of the testicles anymore, so I'm going to let them atrophy, okay? So there is a drawback that people have to consider if they're taking anabolic steroids for bodybuilding reasons. A lot of times as you get older in males, you have what's called andropause, which is still debated, but it's where you create less testosterone, so they then take anabolic steroids to replace the testosterone, the natural testosterone. And in that case, it's such a regulated amount that the body's like, oh, this is good, I need this, I don't have to decrease the size of any reproductive organs, everything's fine. And then you get a natural level of things. Another interesting thing about steroids, which we'll talk about later too, is that they leak out of your skin. And so there have been cases where bodybuilders go to, they're taking anabolic steroids to get really big, and then they're really sweaty, and they go hug somebody, like their child who hasn't gone through puberty yet, and then the child starts going through puberty way too early because suddenly they're getting a big old wash of testosterone that they shouldn't be getting because their body hasn't started making it yet. But our bodies they're not so smart when it comes to hormones, and as long as you are being exposed to them, the body's like, awesome, I'm going to use this. And so there have been cases where somebody has taken overdoses of anabolic steroids, sweat a bunch of it out of their skin, hugged their kid, and then the kid starts growing a beard at like age 8. And so that's something people need to consider. Also, remember, if you hit puberty too early, you stop growing. And so it's just a myriad of problems to consider if you're taking anabolic steroids. So many problems. On the other hand, so that's hypertrophy, where it can happen through many different reasons. Atrophy is where you have a decrease in size of filaments. So this will happen if someone stops working out, or if you like break a leg and you can't walk on it for a while, your muscles will atrophy because you're not working them out. Basically, our body says, I'm not going to waste energy on something if I don't need it. So if you're not going to, it's like with the bones. If you're not going to use the bones in resistance training, then we can break them down because it's too much energy to maintain it. Same thing with the muscles. If you're not going to work out a muscle, you start to atrophy them. This happens through, so this can happen through lack of use. This can happen through denervation. So that's the loss of nerves. Because remember, these muscles need to be activated by nerves. Or it can just happen with age. We just over time our muscles don't respond as much. We start to lose muscle mass. All right. So there's a few interesting / terrifying kinds of diseases that are associated with muscles. So fatigue, this is a myopathy, so this is just little problems that happen with muscles. Fatigue is where you have an accumulation of lactic acid, so you have too much fermentation happening, you get really tired, your body hurts, and you can't work out anymore. Okay, soreness is where you have these little micro tears in the fibers. That's actually a good thing because when you tear the fiber, you build up more fiber, and so within the fiber, so it's not you're building up food. So we say that you build up a fiber. I just want to say use vernacular, which is not the accurate term. So you're building up this fiber. So what's happening actually is within each fiber, so remember the fiber is the muscle cell itself. Within that fiber, you're having tearing of the sarcomeres. So in order to prevent future tearing, you just create more filaments within that fiber, which means you have more areas for contraction. So soreness is a sign that could be a sign that you're building up more muscle tissue. Muscle tetany is a cramp. A lot of times it could be because you don't have enough calcium, you're not using your muscles, it could be a stress issue because you're holding contractions when you shouldn't be, etc. It's just, tetany is the fancy word for a cramp. If you have a uterus, our cramping is thought to be because, so PMS cramping is thought to be because your uterus, which is a muscle-lined organ, is contracting and contracting to get rid of the uterine lining. And so that cramping could be that, we don't store a lot of calcium there, and it's just a muscle that only gets used once a month, and suddenly it's hurt, it's painful, and so that could be why we have those kind of cramps. Nobody really knows. It's frustrating. Paralysis is where you have a lack of voluntary motion. It could be due to spinal cord injury. So a lot of times you see this in car accident victims. They have a spinal cord injury. They can't use their legs. They can't use their arms, etc. Okay. A couple more myopathies. We have, I used to have no, that's a different one. Okay, so, I used to have a picture of tetanus. That's something different, actually. So, there are a couple that are caused by, genetic problems or medications, or viral things. So this Duchenne's muscular dystrophy means you don't have an active cytoskeleton. Your cytoskeleton are those actin and myosin fibers. If you don't have a functional actin and myosin fiber system, you can't do contractions. So that's a problem. Lou Gehrig's disease is technically called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So this is where your motor neurons can't function. So if your motor neurons what they do is they tell your skeletal muscles to contract. If those aren't functioning anymore, then you can't contract certain muscles, and you just start to atrophy. I'm gonna skip. This is just if you don't have those ACH receptors, you can release as much acetylcholine. You could be stimulating a muscle as much as possible, but if your sarcolemma, that cell membrane around the fibers isn't paying attention, if it cannot see that acetylcholine is present, it's not going to activate the whole sarcolemma, which is then not going to release calcium, which means no muscle contraction can happen. Polio is a viral infection that's been eradicated mostly in the U.S. People who are anti-vaxxers, people who are against vaccines, are no longer, Well, polio actually we don't even have we don't use polio vaccines anymore. This is an older disease. Other parts of the world though still do have polio because they don't have the vaccines for them. So that's a problem. What this does is it again attacks those motor neurons, so you can't. If you don't have the motor neuron stimulating the muscle atrophies. You can't use it anyway, and that is problematic. Yeah. So I think so that's all we're gonna do for today. In our next module, I'm gonna go into more detail about that sliding filament theory because it's really important. Hint, hint. Know it for the next test. But for now, I think this lecture has gone on long enough, and so I'll end it here. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.